The dust kicked up by his boots settled slowly in the afternoon heat as Jake Morrison adjusted his rope with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. The leather felt familiar between his calloused fingers, worn smooth by countless hours of work with stubborn cattle and even more stubborn men. He was preparing for another day's work when he heard it, a sound that made him pause mid-motion. Laughter, light, musical, and completely unexpected in this harsh corner of the Arizona Territory. She emerged from behind the trading post like a vision conjured from the desert heat itself. Ayanna, daughter of Chief Running Bear, moved with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this land in ways Jake never could. Her dark eyes sparkled with mischief as she watched him fumble with his rope. And when she spoke, her voice carried both challenge and invitation. "Cowboy, why's your rope always so eager to tangle?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, carrying meanings neither dared to voice aloud. Jake felt his cheeks burn. Not from the sun, but from something far more dangerous. Here was a woman who could see right through his carefully constructed walls, who could make him feel like a green kid again with just a few words and that knowing smile. Before I continue with this incredible story of forbidden attraction in the Wild West, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we bring these untold stories of the frontier to life. The truth was, Jake's rope had been giving him trouble all morning, coiling wrong and catching on everything it shouldn't. But now, looking into Ayanna's eyes, he wondered if maybe it wasn't the rope that was tangled at all. Maybe it was his heart, caught up in something he had no business feeling for the chief's daughter. The unspoken rules of the frontier were clear. White cowboys and Cherokee women didn't mix. It was a recipe for trouble that could get a man killed or worse, exiled from the only life he'd ever known. But Ayanna seemed to thrive on danger. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the sage and wildflowers in her hair, close enough to see the tiny flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made his pulse quicken. "My grandmother always said that when a rope tangles without reason, it's because it's trying to tell you something important." Jake swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry as the desert around them. "And what might that be?" he managed to ask, his voice rougher than he intended. Her smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth. "That maybe you're trying too hard to control something that wants to be free." She reached out and touched the rope in his hands, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm and straight to his heart. "Or maybe," she continued, her eyes never leaving his, "it's trying to catch something worth keeping." The implications of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just innocent flirtation. This was dangerous territory, the kind that could start wars between peoples who were already walking a knife's edge of peace. Jake knew he should step back, tip his hat politely and ride away before this went any further. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing, the right thing according to every rule he'd ever been taught. Instead, he found himself stepping closer. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small trading post that served as neutral ground between the Cherokee settlement and the cattle ranches that dotted the territory. It was one of the few places where white settlers and Native Americans could interact without immediate suspicion or hostility, though even here tensions simmered just beneath the surface, like water about to boil. Jake had been coming to Murphy's trading post for 3 years now, ever since he'd started working for the Double R Ranch. He'd seen Ayanna before, of course. It was impossible not to notice her. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention without trying, who could silence a room full of rough men with nothing more than her presence. But they'd never spoken directly, never been alone like this. "You're playing with fire, you know that," Jake said, though he made no move to back away. If anything, he seemed drawn to her like a moth to flame, helpless to resist, even though he knew he might get burned. Ayanna's laugh was like silver bells in the wind. "Fire keeps you warm on cold nights," she replied, her eyes dancing with mischief. "And it lights the way when you're lost in the dark. Sometimes a little danger is exactly what a person needs." She was right, and Jake knew it. He'd been lost for longer than he cared to admit, drifting from ranch to ranch, town to town, never putting down roots, never allowing himself to want anything more than his next paycheck and a bottle of whiskey to wash away the loneliness. But standing here with Ayanna, feeling the heat of her presence and the promise in her words, he felt something stirring inside him that he'd thought was long dead. "Your father wouldn't approve," he said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "My father has many concerns," Ayana replied, her tone growing more serious. "The safety of our people, the encroachment of settlers on our lands, the broken promises of the government in Washington. Whether his daughter talks to a cowboy about tangled ropes—" She shrugged elegantly. "That might not even make his list." But Jake knew better. Chief Running Bear was known throughout the territory as a fair but fierce leader who would do anything to protect his people. The Cherokee had already been forced from their ancestral lands once, driven west on the Trail of Tears that had claimed so many lives. They'd rebuilt here in Arizona, carved out a new existence in this harsh landscape, but they remained vigilant against any threat to their hard-won peace. A romance between his daughter and a white cowboy would be seen as exactly that kind of threat. "Besides," Ayana continued, stepping even closer, "who says he has to know? The desert keeps secrets well, and I've always been good at keeping mine." The suggestion in her words was unmistakable, and Jake felt his resolve crumbling like a dam in a flash flood. He'd always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who did the right thing even when it cost him, but principles seemed like cold comfort when faced with the warmth of Ayana's smile and the promise of something real, something that could fill the empty spaces in his soul. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "Meet me tonight," she said simply. "After the moon rises, there's a place by the old cottonwood grove, about a mile north of here. You know it?" Jake nodded. Every cowboy in the territory knew the cottonwood grove. It was a landmark, a place where travelers could find shade and water. It was also isolated, hidden from prying eyes by the rolling hills and scattered mesas that defined this part of Arizona. "Ayana," he started, but she pressed a finger to his lips, silencing him. "Don't think so much, cowboy," she whispered. "Sometimes the heart knows things the mind hasn't figured out yet. Sometimes you have to trust the tangle." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there with his rope in his hands and his world turned upside down. He watched her go, admiring the sway of her hips and the proud set of her shoulders, and knew that he was already lost. Whatever consequences might come, whatever dangers lay ahead, he would be at that cottonwood grove tonight. Because some tangles, he was beginning to realize, were worth getting caught in. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks that Jake performed with only half his attention. He helped move cattle from one pasture to another, mended fence posts damaged by the recent storms, and checked on the water levels in the stock tanks. But through it all his mind kept drifting back to Ayana and her invitation. His fellow cowboys noticed his distraction. "You feeling all right, Jake?" asked Tommy Rodriguez, a young vaquero who'd been working the double R for about 6 months. "You seem like your head's in the clouds today." "Just tired," Jake replied, which wasn't entirely a lie. He was tired. Tired of the loneliness, tired of the endless cycle of work and sleep and work again, tired of feeling like he was just marking time until death finally claimed him. But he was also more awake than he'd felt in years. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that rivaled any artist's masterpiece, Jake found himself growing increasingly nervous. What was he doing? What was she doing? This was madness, pure and simple, the kind of madness that got people killed in this unforgiving land. Yet, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky and the moon began its slow rise over the desert, Jake found himself saddling his horse and riding north toward the cottonwood grove. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom, and his palms were slick with sweat, despite the cooling night air. The cottonwood grove was exactly as he remembered it, a small oasis of green in the brown and tan landscape. Fed by a spring that bubbled up from deep underground, the trees rustled softly in the evening breeze, their leaves whispering secrets to the night. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to a low branch, then stood waiting in the dappled moonlight that filtered through the canopy above. He didn't have to wait long. Ayana appeared like a ghost, moving so silently through the shadows that he didn't see her until she was almost close enough to touch. She'd changed from her daytime clothes into a simple dress of soft deerskin that hugged her curves and moved with her like a second skin. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and in the moonlight she looked like some ancient goddess come to earth. "You came," she said, and he could hear the relief in her voice. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Jake asked. She smiled, but there was something vulnerable in her expression that he hadn't seen before. "I hoped you would, but hope and certainty are different things, especially when you're asking someone to risk everything for a chance at something that might not even be real." "It feels real to me," Jake said, stepping closer. "More real than anything has in a long time." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, both aware that they were standing at a crossroads that would change their lives forever. Behind them lay the safe, predictable world they'd always known. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of something extraordinary. "My grandmother used to tell stories," Ayanna said softly, "about the old days before the white man came. She said that sometimes the spirits would bring two people together across great divides, different tribes, different worlds, because their souls were meant to be joined. She called it the Great Tangling, when two lives became so intertwined that they could never truly be separated again." Jake felt something shift inside his chest, like a lock clicking open after years of being sealed shut. "And do you believe those stories?" "I'm starting to," she whispered. The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving, drawn together by forces neither fully understood, but both felt powerfully. When Jake reached out to touch her face, his fingers trembling slightly, Ayanna leaned into his palm, like a flower, turning toward the sun. "This is dangerous," he said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "The best things usually are," she replied. And then, under the ancient cottonwood trees with the desert wind singing around them and the stars bearing witness overhead, Jake Morrison kissed Ayanna Running Bear and felt his world shift on its axis. It was a kiss that tasted of possibility and rebellion, of hope and desperation, of two souls recognizing each other across the vast divide of culture and circumstance. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers and tried to make sense of what was happening to him. "What do we do now?" he asked. "Now," Ayanna said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were contemplating. "We figure out how to untangle this mess without destroying everything we care about." But even as she spoke the words, both of them knew that some tangles were meant to be permanent. Some knots once tied were never meant to be undone. The weeks that followed their first meeting at the Cottonwood Grove passed in a haze of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. Jake found excuses to visit the trading post more frequently, and Ayanna always seemed to be there when he arrived, as if she possessed some sixth sense that told her when he was coming. They were careful, painfully, meticulously careful. They never met in the same place twice, never stayed together longer than an hour, never gave anyone reason to suspect that their relationship had evolved beyond casual acquaintance. But despite their precautions, Jake could feel the weight of suspicious eyes beginning to settle on them. It started with small things, sideways glances from other cowboys when he mentioned needing supplies from Murphy's, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room, the way conversations seemed to die when he approached groups of his fellow ranch hands. "People are starting to talk," Tommy Rodriguez warned him one evening as they sat around the campfire after a long day of moving cattle. "About you and that Cherokee girl." Jake's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression neutral. "Don't know what you mean," he said, taking a swig from his coffee cup to buy himself time to think. "Come on, Jake," Tommy said, his voice gentle but insistent. "We've all seen the way you look at her, and the way she looks at you. Hell, a blind man could see there's something going on between you two. Even if there was," Jake said carefully, "which there isn't, what business would it be of anyone else's?" Tommy's expression grew serious. "In a perfect world, none at all. But this ain't a perfect world. And you know it. There are people in this territory who would see a white man courting a Cherokee woman as an insult that needs answering, and there are people on her side who might feel the same way about it." Jake knew Tommy was right, but the knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. He'd been so caught up in the intoxicating rush of his feelings for Ayanna that he'd allowed himself to forget the harsh realities of the world they lived in. The Arizona Territory in 1885 was not a place that looked kindly on relationships that crossed racial lines, especially when those relationships involved the daughter of a prominent Cherokee chief. "What are you saying?" Jake asked, though he was afraid he already knew. "I'm saying be careful," Tommy replied. "Real careful. Because if this thing between you and her is real, then you're both walking on thin ice over very deep water, and if that ice breaks—" He shrugged, but the gesture was heavy with implication. That night, Jake lay awake in his bedroll, staring up at the stars, and wrestling with doubts that felt like physical pain in his chest. Was he being selfish? Was he putting Ayanna in danger by pursuing this relationship? Would she be better off if he just rode away and never looked back? But even as these thoughts tormented him, he knew he couldn't give her up. What they had was too precious, too rare, too real to abandon without a fight. He'd spent his whole life drifting from place to place, never finding anything worth staying for. Now he'd found not just something, but someone worth fighting for. The next time they met, at an abandoned line shack about 5 miles from the trading post, Jake shared his concerns with Ayanna. She listened in silence as he told her about the growing suspicions, the whispered warnings, the sense that they were being watched. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked when he finished, her voice carefully neutral. "About us?" "Never," Jake said immediately. "About the wisdom of continuing to meet like this? Every damn day." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring out through the cracked window of the old shack at the desert landscape beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but determined. "My people have a saying," she said. "The river that runs underground is often the strongest. Maybe it's time we stopped trying to hide what we feel and started figuring out how to make it work in the open." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that secrets have a way of becoming poison if you keep them too long," she replied, turning to face him. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to trust that what we have is strong enough to survive in the daylight." The idea terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Going public with their relationship would be like lighting a fuse on a stick of dynamite. There was no telling what kind of explosion might result. But continuing to sneak around was slowly killing them both, turning something beautiful into something furtive and shameful. "Your father," Jake began, "will have to accept that his daughter is a grown woman capable of making her own choices," Ayanna finished firmly. "And if he can't accept that, then we'll deal with that problem when we come to it." Jake admired her courage even as he worried about her naivety. Chief Running Bear was not a man who would simply accept his daughter's choice to court a white cowboy. No matter how grown up she might be, there would be consequences, potentially severe ones for both of them. But looking into Ayanna's eyes, seeing the determination and love shining there, Jake felt his own resolve strengthen. Maybe Tommy was right about the thin ice and deep water, but maybe some things were worth the risk of drowning for. "All right," he said, reaching out to take her hands in his. "But we do this smart. We don't just announce it to the world and hope for the best. We find allies, people who might support us, or at least not actively oppose us. We build bridges before we burn any behind us." Ayanna's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Now you're thinking like a Cherokee," she said. "We don't just charge into battle. We plan, we strategize, we find the path that leads to victory with the least bloodshed." As they began to discuss their strategy, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this work. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be safe, but nothing worthwhile ever was. The rope that had started this whole thing still hung from his saddle, and Jake found himself thinking about Ayanna's grandmother's words, about tangles that were meant to tell you something important. Maybe his rope had been trying to tell him that some things in life were worth getting caught up in, worth fighting for, worth risking everything to keep. And maybe, just maybe, love was the strongest rope of all. The first test of their resolve came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days after their conversation at the line shack, Jake was in Murphy's trading post buying supplies when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "I'm telling you, Murphy, something needs to be done about this situation," a voice was saying. Jake recognized it as belonging to Ezra Blackwood, a wealthy rancher who owned spread about 20 miles south of the Double R. Blackwood was known throughout the territory as a hard man with strong opinions about keeping the races separate. "Now, Ezra," came Murphy's placating voice, "I don't see as how it's any of our business what people do in their private time, long as they're not causing trouble in my establishment." "Private time?" Blackwood's voice rose dangerously. "There ain't nothing private about the way that cowboy's been sniffing around Chief Running Bear's daughter. Half the territory's talking about it, and if we don't put a stop to it soon, we're going to have real problems on our hands." Jake's hand instinctively moved to the gun at his hip, but he forced himself to remain calm. Starting a gunfight in Murphy's would only make things worse for everyone involved. "What kind of problems?" Murphy asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The kind that end with blood in the dirt and good men dead, Blackwood replied grimly. You think Chief Running Bear's going to stand by and let some white saddle tramp court his daughter? Or you think the other ranchers are going to tolerate having their property values threatened by this kind of mixing? Jake had heard enough. He stepped around the corner, making his presence known. Afternoon, gentlemen, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Couldn't help but overhear my name being mentioned. Blackwood's face flushed red, but he didn't back down. Morrison, just the man I wanted to see. We need to have a talk. I'm listening, Jake said, though every instinct told him to walk away before this escalated further. You need to stay away from that Cherokee girl, Blackwood said bluntly. Whatever you think is happening between you two, it needs to stop. Now, before people get hurt. Jake felt anger rising in his chest like floodwater, but he kept his voice level. With all due respect, Mr. Blackwood, I don't recall asking for your advice on my personal affairs. This stopped being personal the minute you started making eyes at Chief Running Bear's daughter, Blackwood shot back. Now it's a matter of territorial security. We've got a fragile peace with the Cherokee, and your little romance could shatter it like glass. Or, Jake said, stepping closer, it could be exactly the kind of bridge building that makes that peace stronger. Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. Bridge building? Boy, you're even more naive than I thought. The only thing your bridge building is going to accomplish is getting a lot of good people killed when this whole thing explodes. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Murphy looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world, and Jake could see other customers beginning to edge toward the door. This was exactly the kind of public confrontation he and Ayanna had hoped to avoid. I appreciate your concern, Jake said finally, but I'm not going to be dictated to by fear and prejudice. If you have a problem with my choices, that's between you and your conscience. My conscience is clear, Blackwood snarled. It's your conscience you should be worried about when this all goes to hell. And mark my words, Morrison, it will go to hell, and when it does, the blood will be on your hands. With that ominous warning, Blackwood stormed out of the trading post, leaving Jake standing there with his heart pounding and his mind racing. The confrontation had been inevitable, he supposed, but that didn't make it any less unsettling. Jake, Murphy said quietly, maybe you should consider what Ezra said. I'm not saying I agree with his methods, but he's not wrong about the potential for trouble. Jake turned to look at the older man, seeing genuine concern in his weathered features. Murphy had always been fair in his dealings with both white settlers and Cherokee, and his trading post had become a symbol of peaceful coexistence in the territory. If Murphy was worried, then the situation was more serious than Jake had realized. What would you do, Murphy? Jake asked. If you were in my position? Murphy was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. I'd ask myself whether what I was feeling was worth the price that might have to be paid, he said finally. Not just by me, but by everyone around me. Love's a powerful thing, Jake, but so is hate, and sometimes hate wins no matter how pure the love might be. The words hit Jake like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He was asking Ayanna to risk everything, her relationship with her family, her standing in her community, possibly even her life, for a love that might not be strong enough to survive the forces arrayed against it. But as he rode back to the Double R that evening, Jake found himself thinking not about Blackwood's threats or Murphy's warnings, but about the way Ayanna's eyes lit up when she saw him, the way her laughter could chase away the loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years. He thought about the conversations they'd shared under the stars, the dreams they'd begun to weave together, the sense of completeness he felt when he was with her. Some things, he decided, were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost might be. The question was whether Ayanna would feel the same way when she learned about the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, as he was checking the fence line on the northern boundary of the Double R, he saw a familiar figure riding toward him across the desert. Ayanna sat her horse like she'd been born in the saddle, moving with the fluid grace that never failed to take his breath away. But as she drew closer, Jake could see the tension in her posture, the worry lines around her eyes. Something was wrong. We need to talk, she said without preamble, as she reined in her horse beside his. I was about to say the same thing, Jake replied. You first. Ayanna took a deep breath as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. My father knows, she said simply. About us. About everything. Jake felt the bottom drop out of his world. How? Someone saw us at the line shack, she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "One of the young warriors from our village. He told my father last night." "What did he say?" Jake asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. "What you'd expect him to say," Ayana replied. "That I was bringing shame on our family, that I was betraying our people, that I was being used by a white man who would abandon me the moment things got difficult." The pain in her voice was like a knife in Jake's heart. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him he was wrong," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "I told him that what we have is real, and that I won't give it up just because it makes other people uncomfortable." Jake felt a surge of pride and love so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. This woman, this incredible, brave, beautiful woman, was willing to stand up to her own father for him. The magnitude of that sacrifice was almost too much to comprehend. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Ayana said, her voice growing stronger, "we find out whether love really is stronger than fear. Because my father has given me an ultimatum. Either I end this relationship immediately and agree to marry the man he's chosen for me, or I'm no longer welcome in his house or his tribe." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd known there would be consequences, but he hadn't imagined they would be this severe, this immediate, this final. "Ayana," he said, reaching out to take her hand, "I can't ask you to give up your family for me. I won't ask you to do that." She squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes blazing with determination. "You're not asking," she said firmly. "I'm choosing. I'm choosing you, Jake Morrison. I'm choosing us. I'm choosing love over fear, hope over tradition, the future over the past. But your people, your family, will have to learn to accept my choice," she finished. "Or they'll have to live without me. Either way, I've made my decision." Jake stared at her, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was offering, what she was sacrificing. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Ayana replied. "The question is, are you ready to fight for us, really fight? Because it's going to get ugly, Jake, uglier than either of us imagined." Jake thought about Blackwood's threats, about the whispered conversations and suspicious glances, about the powder keg they were sitting on that could explode at any moment. He thought about the safe, predictable life he could have if he just walked away, if he just let her go and went back to being a drifting cowboy with no ties and no responsibilities. Then he looked into Ayana's eyes and saw his future reflected there. Not safe, not predictable, but real and meaningful and worth every risk they would have to take. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Then we'd better get started," Ayana said, a smile breaking across her face like dawn after the darkest night. "Because we've got a war to win." As they sat there on horseback in the middle of the vast Arizona desert, with the sun climbing toward its zenith and the future stretching out before them like an uncharted territory, Jake Morrison realized that his rope had finally taught him its most important lesson. Sometimes the best things in life were the ones that tangled you up so completely that you never wanted to get free. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, those tangles became the foundation for something beautiful and lasting and true. The war Ayana had spoken of began in earnest within days of their conversation. Chief Running Bear, true to his word, formally banished his daughter from the Cherokee settlement, declaring that she was no longer his child and that any member of the tribe who aided or sheltered her would face similar consequences. The news spread through the territory like wildfire, reaching the ears of every rancher, cowboy, and settler within 100 miles. Reactions were swift and predictably divided. Some, like Ezra Blackwood, saw it as vindication of their warnings about the dangers of racial mixing. Others, particularly those who had known and respected Ayana, were horrified by the harshness of her father's response. Jake found himself caught in the middle of a storm that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. At the Double R, his fellow cowboys were split between those who supported his right to love whom he chose and those who believed he was bringing trouble down on all their heads. "This is madness, Jake," said Bill Henderson, the ranch foreman, during a tense conversation in the bunkhouse. "You're putting everyone at risk for the sake of one woman." "That one woman is worth more than all the rest of this put together," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. "Maybe so," Bill conceded, "but worth enough to start a war? Because that's where this is heading and you know it." Jake did know it, and the knowledge sat heavy on his shoulders like a lead blanket. But every time he considered backing down, every time he thought about the easier path of just walking away, He remembered Ayana's courage in standing up to her father, her willingness to sacrifice everything for their love. How could he do any less? The situation reached a crisis point, 2 weeks after Chief Running Bear's ultimatum. Jake was in town picking up supplies when he encountered a group of Cherokee warriors led by Ayana's brother, Joseph Running Bear. The young man's face was a mask of barely controlled rage as he confronted Jake in the middle of the dusty main street. "You," Joseph said, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, "have brought shame on my family and dishonor to my sister. I challenge you to settle this like a man." A crowd began to gather, sensing the potential for violence. Jake could see faces in the crowd, some eager for bloodshed, others worried about the consequences of what was about to happen. This was exactly the kind of public confrontation that could spark the larger conflict everyone feared. "I don't want to fight you, Joseph," Jake said, keeping his voice calm and his hands visible. "Your sister made her choice freely. I didn't force her into anything." "You seduced her with lies and false promises," Joseph spat. "You made her believe that a white man could truly love a Cherokee woman, that there could be a future for such a union. But we both know the truth. When things get difficult, when the pressure becomes too great, you'll abandon her just like every other white man who has ever used one of our women." The accusation hit Jake like a slap across the face, not because it was true, but because he could see that Joseph genuinely believed it. In the young warrior's mind, Jake was just another in a long line of white men who had taken advantage of Native American women and then discarded them when it became inconvenient. "You're wrong," Jake said firmly. "I love your sister and I'm not going anywhere." "Prove it," Joseph challenged. "Face me in combat. If you win, I'll accept that your feelings are genuine, and I'll try to convince my father to reconsider his position. If I win," he shrugged, "the problem solves itself." Jake felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. He knew that accepting the challenge would be playing into exactly the kind of violence that everyone feared, but he also knew that backing down would be seen as cowardice and would only make things worse for Ayana. "All right," he said finally, "but not here, not like this. If we're going to do this, we do it properly. Choose your weapons and your ground." Joseph's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Knives," he said. "At sunset, the old corral behind Murphy's trading post." As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement and apprehension, Jake felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Murphy himself, his weathered face creased with worry. "You sure about this, son?" the old trader asked. "Joseph Running Bear is one of the finest warriors in the Cherokee Nation. He's been training with blade and bow since he could walk." "I'm sure," Jake replied, though his stomach was churning with nerves. "This has to end somewhere, Murphy. Might as well be here and now. And if you lose?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Then I guess Ayana will know that I was willing to die for her," he said finally. "That ought to count for something." Word of the impending duel spread through the territory like wildfire. By sunset, a crowd of nearly 100 people had gathered around the old corral behind Murphy's trading post. Cowboys, ranchers, Cherokee warriors, townspeople and traders, all pressed close to witness what many believed would be a defining moment in the relationship between the white and Native American communities. Jake arrived at the appointed time to find Joseph already waiting, stripped to the waist and holding a wicked-looking knife with a bone handle. The young Cherokee warrior moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his muscles rippling beneath bronze skin marked with traditional tattoos. "Last chance to back out," Joseph said as Jake approached. "Walk away now and I'll make sure your death is quick." "I'm not walking away," Jake replied, drawing his own knife, a simple but well-balanced blade he'd carried for years. "But I want you to know that I don't hate you for this. You're trying to protect your sister in the only way you know how. I can respect that." Joseph's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise, but it was quickly replaced by grim determination. "Pretty words won't save you, white man." The two men began to circle each other, knives held low and ready. The crowd fell silent, sensing the deadly seriousness of what they were witnessing. This wasn't a barroom brawl or a drunken argument. This was a fight to the death between two men who each believed they were defending something precious. Joseph struck first, his blade flashing in the dying light as he lunged forward with lightning speed. Jake barely managed to parry the attack, the impact sending shockwaves up his arm. The Cherokee warrior was every bit as skilled as Murphy had warned, his movements precise and economical. wasting no energy on unnecessary flourishes. They fought in deadly silence, the only sounds the scrape of steel on steel and the harsh breathing of two men pushing themselves to their limits. Jake quickly realized that he was outmatched in terms of pure skill. Joseph had been trained from childhood in the art of combat, while Jake's fighting experience came from barroom brawls and the occasional encounter with rustlers. But Jake had something that Joseph didn't: desperation born of love. Every time the Cherokee warrior's blade came close to finding its mark, Jake thought of Ayanna and found the strength to keep fighting. He thought of her courage in defying her father, her willingness to sacrifice everything for their love, and he knew that he couldn't let her down. The turning point came when Joseph, perhaps overconfident in his superior skill, attempted a complex maneuver that left him momentarily off balance. Jake seized the opportunity, stepping inside the other man's guard and driving his knee into Joseph's solar plexus. The Cherokee warrior doubled over, gasping for breath, and Jake could have ended the fight right then with a thrust to the throat. Instead, he stepped back and waited for Joseph to recover. "Why?" Joseph gasped, looking up at Jake with confusion and something that might have been respect. "Why didn't you finish it?" "Because killing you won't prove anything except that I'm willing to kill," Jake replied, "and because your sister would never forgive me if I took her brother from her, even if he was trying to take me from her." Joseph straightened slowly, his knife still in his hand but no longer held in an aggressive posture. "You could have ended this," he said. "You had me beaten." "The fight's not over," Jake pointed out. "You can still finish what you started." For a long moment the two men stared at each other across the dusty corral. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then slowly, Joseph lowered his knife and stepped back. "No," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "The fight is over. You've proven what you came here to prove." A murmur ran through the crowd as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't the bloody conclusion they'd expected, the definitive victory of one side over the other. Instead, they'd seen something far more complex and meaningful, a moment of understanding between two men who had every reason to hate each other. "Does this mean—" Jake began. "It means I believe you when you say you love my sister," Joseph replied. "It means I'll speak to my father about reconsidering his position. I can't promise he'll listen, but I'll try." "That's all I can ask for," Jake said, extending his hand. Joseph looked at the offered hand for a moment, then clasped it firmly. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "She's given up everything for you. Don't make her regret it." "I won't," Jake promised. "I swear to you I won't." As the crowd began to disperse, many looking disappointed by the lack of bloodshed, Jake felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Ayanna standing behind him, tears streaming down her face. "I saw the whole thing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so afraid." "It's over," Jake said, pulling her into his arms. "It's finally over." But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew they weren't entirely true. The duel with Joseph had been just one battle in a larger war, and there would be other challenges ahead. Ezra Blackwood and men like him wouldn't be satisfied with a peaceful resolution to the conflict. There would be more tests, more obstacles, more people trying to tear them apart. But standing there in the gathering darkness with Ayanna in his arms, and the knowledge that he'd earned at least one ally in her brother, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine hope for the future. The rope that had started this whole adventure still hung from his saddle, and Jake found himself thinking once again about tangles and what they meant. Maybe some tangles weren't problems to be solved, but gifts to be treasured. Maybe the best things in life were the ones that bound you so completely that you couldn't imagine being free. And maybe, just maybe, love really was strong enough to overcome anything the world could throw at it. 3 months later, Jake Morrison and Ayanna Running Bear were married in a simple ceremony at Murphy's trading post, with the old trader himself officiating and a crowd of supporters from both communities in attendance. Chief Running Bear was not among them, but Joseph was, and his presence gave hope that the rift in the family might someday be healed. It wasn't the ending that anyone had expected when this story began, but it was the ending that love had written for itself, and in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory, where survival often depended on the strength of the bonds between people, that was perhaps the most important victory of all. The rope that had once seemed so eager to tangle had finally found its purpose, not in capturing or controlling, but in binding two hearts together in a knot that would never come undone.